these tribal, to these nomadic tribes, having some need for defense for a short period of time, and we will talk about it in a minute. The question of nomads is the one that is most interesting now, and I want to say a few words about that because I think this is where the most important advancement in the research on the region happened in recent years. And I also encourage you to watch in this conference to talk about ancient Edom. Because ancient Edom, the neighbor to the south, is very unique in its archaeological record. The only reason that it's very unique and it's different is because the Edomites engaged in copper production. In the land of Edom, we have two centers of copper production, one in Timnah in modern-day Israel, and one in Feinan in modern-day Jordan. I was lucky enough to work in the mines of Feinan. I didn't mine copper, of course. To work in the mines is very hard, but we were working in the mines of Feinan as part of the American expedition there in the early 2000s, and the results of this recent research in Feinan and our own research in Timnah, we are excavating in Timnah in the last 10 years, demonstrated that these Edomites were the ones that were responsible for the copper production at that particular time. Starting in the 12th century and going all the way to the 9th century, there was a peak in copper production in the region. And the evidence is overwhelming, the archaeological evidence. Okay? What we see is mines and copper smelting sites, and in these copper smelting sites we have evidence of prestigious garments. We have evidence of elite class that ate great food that came all the way from the Mediterranean. We have evidence of something that is definitely a kingdom. Before our research in the region, these remains of the mines were attributed to empires. So also all of the scholars thought that only empires can be responsible for this amazing production at that time period. But our recent research, which dated the sites precisely by using radiocarbon dates, demonstrated that the age of empires is out of question. The mines were operating during the time of these Edomite nomadic tribes. Now what's more important, and is what is relevant actually to the story of Ammon and Moab, is the following. Imagine that this Edomite kingdom was there during the 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th centuries BC. But this tribal coalition, hypothetically, would engage in Arabian trade or agriculture, but not in copper production. So it means that they will leave nothing behind archaeologically. And if you go to the region, we would say that there was an occupational gap. And if we find some stuff, maybe like a small temple or some burials, like we have in Ammon and Moab, we would say, okay, we have some Bedouins here, from some tribes, some simple society, some pastoral nomads that went through the land, but nothing that that can tell us that there was a strong and powerful kingdom here. What I want to say is that in contrast to the regular perception of nomads that we have today as scholars, but also as, you know, the common, the lay person, like everybody, when we think about nomads, we don't think about big, powerful kingdoms. We think about the Bedouins of today. We think about a region without law. We think about places and societies that cannot create kingdoms. This is the default. This is what we go immediately in our interpretation, in our mind. But the example from Edom shows that in the early Iron Age, it was not that. It was exceptional period. It was exactly that time that these nomads created strong coalitions and were powerful in the history of the region. This is very important to the study of Ammon and Moab, because I think that now, after we have the example from Edom, and we are now know that a powerful kingdom was there already in the 11th century BC, if not earlier, the same situation was probably true for Moab and Ammon. But because the Moabites and Ammonites did not engage in copper production, we see very little of them in archaeology, very little. In Moab, we have an exception. In 1930, there was a very interesting discovery in a site called Balua. It's a very interesting site south of the Arnon, in the core of Moab, which is mostly dated to the late 11th and 10th centuries BCE. But this discovery was a stele. It's called the Balua stele, made of basalt, with an engraving of a king flanked by a god and a goddess. Okay, so this stele has an engraving that is actually is Egyptian in style. We have some very good parallels in Egypt. And the king himself, he's depicted as a Shasu nomad, with a very specific hairdress that is related to these nomads of the region. And this is related to the style, to the Egyptian style that we know in Egypt from the 19th and 20th dynasties, which means the late Bronze Age. So the Balua stele is usually dated to this period, let's say, for example, 13th, early 12th century BCE. But because we don't have any other archaeology to go with this stele, some archaeologists downdate the stele to the late 11th and early 10th centuries BCE, when we have this short-lived phenomenon of protected sites, of defended sites in southern Moab. Okay? And this is what I call the architectural bias. It's following what we see in visible archaeology by archaeologists. And if we really want to think about what was going on there, we have to break free from the archaeological positive, like what we have to see. For me, let's talk about what was going on there. If we accept that the Edomite kingdom was nomadic, and what we have here in the early Iron Age is a strong nomadic state, a strong nomadic kingdom, we can see the same thing going on in Moab. There was a nomadic kingdom there in the 12th century BC and maybe earlier. They didn't leave much behind because they did not engage in copper production, so we don't have their archaeology, but they were still strong. They were so strong that the Egyptians cared about them, and that there was a stele in one of their central locations made of basalt to celebrate some event or the other. This is related to a period that it's quite invisible to us archaeologically, but still nomads were there and they were probably already quite strong. Then in the late 11th century, we see this phenomenon of sites. Most of these sites are called the Mudaina. So this is the phenomenon of the Mudaina sites. But what we see here is a very short period in which these nomads, the invisible nomads, had to defend themselves and had to have some demarcation and permanent places for hiding in time of stress. And they built these sites, probably in connection to the copper trade from Edom that was in its peak at this particular time. And this was the buffer zone with Edom on the southern region of Moab. And imagine a caravan carrying ingots of copper, a very, very important commodity, a very expensive commodity. You had to protect this. So you built some centers for protection, for delineation of the boundary of the Moabites, and most importantly for a commercial exchange. As I said, the history of the region was not always only wars, but they had to have some centers for commercial exchange that are permanent, that are visible, that are that can be navigated too easily. Imagine a caravan of Edomite copper traders. They want to trade copper with the Moabite traders. They didn't have Waze, they didn't have maps, they didn't have calendars. So they had to have a certain place to meet, a certain prominent place to meet in a certain time of the year. So one of these Mudinas was an exchange place for copper with the Moabite traders, let's say all in the full moon of all third month also. So we should understand this short-lived phenomenon of the Mudina sites in southern Moab in light of this nomadic coalition, nomadic kingdom, and is like a snapshot of these nomads that were strong and important before and strong and important after. This is related to the early phase of the Moabites. We have now to consider the possibility that strong nomadic kingdoms existed in the region and that archaeology cannot find the entire picture, and that archaeology is quite limited in helping us to understand the historical background of biblical texts. In fact, understanding this gives a lot of credibility or potential credibility to a lot of disputed biblical texts. And this is already under discussion among the scholarly community. Not everybody accepts this idea, but I think that it's quite easy to understand. The origin of all of these states, including ancient Israel, was nomadic. The idea that these nomads were not capable of anything substantial is something that is a modern idea. There is nothing to say that in the Hebrew Bible itself and also in external sources. It's true that the main reason for thinking about these nomads is something as people that cannot do anything substantial is related to the Bedouins. But if we widen the horizon of parallels, we can remember that the greatest empire in the history of the world was the Mongol Empire. I'm not saying that these little kingdoms were an empire, but I do say that they could have been kingdoms also in the stage where they were nomadic. And this is why we don't see them archaeologically. And the fact that we don't see Ammon and Moab archaeologically in this early Iron Age period does not necessarily mean immediately that all of the descriptions of this early phase in the Hebrew Bible are anachronistic and are not correct. This is something, again, that I call the architectural bias in biblical archaeology. It's rooted bias in the interpretation of archaeology in biblical texts that doesn't take into consideration the capability of these ancient nomads to create kingdoms that could have engaged with other ancient kingdoms and could have been in conflict with other kingdoms, etc., etc. And when we try to look for the archaeology of this early phase of the kingdoms, we have to remember to be careful not to understand the lack of evidence immediately as the lack of the existence of this kind of kingdoms. When we move forward to later on in the period, we have very little about the Ammonites in the archaeological record, but we have one of the most amazing discoveries in biblical archaeology in all times, in Moab. And this is, of course, the Mesha stele. The Mesha stele, which was discovered in 1868 in Dibon, in Diban, the city, the ancient capital of the Moabites. Not in any archaeological excavation context, it was found by the Bedouins, and then a German scholar, Frederick Augustus Klein, he was the first to get to know about this discovery and to tell about it to the rest of the world. The history of the Mesha stele is very interesting. It's not for now to go into detail about this find. It was broken by the Bedouins later on, and some of the pieces went lost, and then they were able to be retrieved, and now they are presented in the Louvre Museum. The important point here is that this is a description that is external to the Bible, which depicts names and stories that we have in the Bible itself. The story of King Mesha of Moab, which is mentioned in the book of Kings, and his conquest of the northern Moabite territory from the Israelites. So here we have strict, direct evidence for the Israelite occupation of the Israelite occupation of the northern part of Moab in the 9th century BCE under the Omride dynasty. The Bible itself tells us a very similar story, not exactly the same story, but it does tell us about King Mesha. In the second book of Kings, chapter 3, verse 4. And look at the beginning of the story. Again, that's not a place to go into all of that. We can talk about the Mesha Stela a lot. I'll just tell something in a minute about current research regarding this amazing find. But look at this biblical description. Now King Mesha of Moab was a sheep breeder. So the king and also his father, they were shepherds. Okay, we're talking about this nomadic origin of these kingdoms. It's very much fitting. This king, Mesha, who used to deliver to the king of Israel, okay, tribute to the king of Israel, 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, king of Israel Ahab, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So King Jehoram marched out of Samaria. Okay, so there was a rebellion, and the Israelite king goes to war against the Moabites together with a coalition with Judah and Edom. It's an interesting story in itself. It's not exactly the same as the story in the Mesha Stele. The Mesha Stele celebrates the victory of the Moabites and the construction of several towns, and also the road that crossed the Arnon, the big canyon that cuts Moab into two. A very interesting depiction, which is very important to the debate about the historicity of the Bible. Since we have this description, there is no doubt that the 9th century is very much rooted in real history. I said that there is some interesting research going on, because in this stele and some of the fragments that were broken and not well understood, André Lamer read the name David. The name David in the stele, and this is an early reference to David, even earlier than the famous stele of Hazael, the king of Aram Damascus. So it's even, it gives even more credibility to the historicity related to the United Monarchy and David and his reign in the region. But recently this was refuted, this identification by Nadav Naaman and others. And the interesting thing that this is in the middle of an active research, and there is a group of scholars who re-examines the stele itself and the remains of it, and they would probably have results, interesting results, very soon. It's not published yet, but I'm telling you it's interesting, and it's related to the debate about the historicity of David and the proper reading of this stele. So, the two kingdoms, Ammon and Moab, appear here and there in the Hebrew Bible. We know the name of their main deity. Moab, the main deity was Kmosh, and Ammon, the main deity was Milcom. They are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible many times. We know about their nomadic origin. At least it's accepted by almost all scholars. And we discussed mostly the early phase of these kingdoms, if there were such kingdoms at all or not. My approach is that nomads at a time period could have created kingdoms, and this is relevant to Moab and Ammon, although we don't have any direct solution to this problem because we don't have archaeology of nomads and we don't have much. We have a little bit here and there. I mentioned the late Bronze Age temple in Ammon. I mentioned the Balua stele in Moab. Some evidence for the existence of these pastoral nomads and some evidence for the importance of these pastoral nomads already in this early phase. So maybe the Israelites, if they were there in the region and if the Exodus has any grain of historicity, what they encountered was a nomadic kingdom that we cannot really trace in the archaeological record. So this is an important step forward in the discussion about the reality of this period. We have to bring, or we have to give the nomads a proper place in all of this discussion about the history of the region. Then we mentioned briefly the biggest discovery in Moab, which is the Mesha stele, or the Moabite stone. It's also called the Moabite stone. There's hundreds of articles published about this inscription, and we mentioned that the reading there of the name of King David is debated, because this is related to the big debate about the united monarchy. The ancient Israelite kingdom is much more accepted among archaeologists as a real historical kingdom. The problem starts when we talk about the united monarchy and the reign of David and his son Solomon. These figures, David specifically conquered the Edomites and Moabites and subjugated them to Jerusalem. But as you probably know pretty well, the historicity of the united monarchy is much debated. But if we understand all of the reality in the region as related to powerful nomads, then archaeology cannot be a major factor in this discussion. And archaeologists have to be much more modest regarding their discussion about the historicity of the text. The Moabites and Ammonites disappeared from the stage of history, like the Edomites. We actually know even less about the disappearance of the Moabites from the stage of history than we know about the Edomites, and even less about the Ammonites. We have the term Moab used as a geographical term also in the Hellenistic, early Roman period, but that's it. The Moabite people, the Ammonite people probably assimilated with the local population that was more and more related to the Arabian tribes of the Nabateans. It was part of Nabatea in the early centuries AD, and we just don't know about these people much more than this kind of disappearing into the social and historical background of the region. Some of what we know about the latest phase is related to Josephus Flavius, who describes the term Moabites in his history. But really, we don't think that they were destroyed at the same time as the Israelites in 586 BC. They probably also survived the Babylonian conquest, but it's really hard to tell. Archaeological evidence is very not decisive about these events.